about 30 seconds left. We are nearly ready to kick off.
Fantastic. Oh, Chile, Joburg. We have London with fantastic weather. That's great, Lauren. I'm off in London on Monday, so I'm hoping the weather holds. We got Damascus, Syria. Yeah, that would be very hot. Bilal, nice to meet you. Tanzania, sometimes cold, sometimes warmer. Yeah.
All right, everybody, it is 3 on the dot and we need to get started. Should we get started, Chris?
Absolutely. We're talking today about income and fundraising strategy. Just by means of introduction. Sorry, Jules, you wanted to have some house rules for us, right?
I did. I just wanted to introduce myself. I'm Juliet and I'm the digital marketer at MZN. And today's speaker is Chris, our managing director. Today, we're going to be talking all about getting your funding strategy right. So please welcome everyone. Please feel free to drop a line in our question box. We're going to try and get through this as quickly as we can and get into our interesting questions. Over to you, Chris.
Thanks, Jules. So we do have a recording that of this one, and everybody who wants to have the slides in the recording, they will be shared with everybody who attends after this. And for those who want it, we also have captions, so you can lean back and don't need to take vicious notes or screenshots. The slides can happily be shared with you. Let's start it off. My name is Chris. I am, as Jules says, still the managing director of MZN International. MZN, of course, you may or may not know already, we basically help NGOs to be better funded, operate better, and deploy smarter strategies. So we are a social consultancy for non-profits, for social enterprises. And our strategy includes to make most of our services subsidized or free by 2030. And with training, we've already gotten there. So this webinar comes from part of our training session and section, and that training is already free for partners. And I'm also pleased to announce that starting September, our in-person classroom-based training around the world is back. So you can sign up for fundraising and donor proposal writing and budget management and various training courses in Nairobi, Kampala, Bangkok, New York, Panama, and all the other areas of the world, wherever you might be. Those training courses, I think, Jules, they'll go online later today, tomorrow?
Yeah, they'll be up and ready by tomorrow.
Cool, excellent. Good, but today we're starting about funding strategy. So today's webinar is a bit more about a strategic part of how we actually build a right funding strategy. So this is not about a specific proposal or a specific part of a proposal or a donor contract, but about how do we set the strategy at large. That, of course, underlies every successful income strategy. So it's you can regard this webinar as the basics of getting it right. And it's been written as a result of 15 years of working with NGOs on their funding strategies, on their capacities. And we included some specific tips. We end with a look at 2 of the largest donors in the world, the USAID and EC, so to see how this connects into the strategy. And I hope that this webinar is concrete enough for you to take some pragmatic tips away and general enough and high level enough for you to take also an approach knowledge away. And with that in mind, let's start straight away. So if you look at the an overall strategy, we had a sprint workshop back last year, and one of our CEOs of an NGO summarized it better than I ever could. She said, look, after the sprint workshop, which is a workshop we do on strategy, she said, we are now clear that just only four value drivers determine ultimately our success and our impact. And our funding strategy needs to support and be built on these in the same measure. So they are basically your operational efficiency. So how fast and how efficient do we get things done? Things done like hiring staff, how quick do we get a proposal out of the way? They are on the other side of it, your donor service and targeting. So this is different from programming. which is a very important distinction. How do we service our donors who are not our key clients? Our key clients are the beneficiaries and the people we work for. But how do we service our donors and how do we target them right? Do we target too generally? Are we just responsive? That's probably not good. Or are we actually targeting specific donors? Do we deliver innovation? That's the third one on the bottom there. Can we talk about things that are new? Are we trying out? Are we failing enough? And then, of course, do we deliver results, our program impact? And if we get these four things, which could, then we are probably doing all right on strategy and impact overall. So it sounds deceptively easy, but there's a lot in there. But if you summarize this slide, and if you don't take anything away from this webinar, I think this slide is the most important part. If you summarize the slide on top here, I hope you can see my cursor, your program impact, your program results, does what you do programmatically work? Is one driver. Driver two, how well do we do it? Are we delayed? Are we having too many overheads? Are we pretty efficient or not? Do we deliver and try out innovation? Number three. And number four, how do we target and service our donors with additional reports, with additional information? How do we engage network them? If these four things are doing well, then you're probably doing all right overall. So I hope that helps as a sort of mindset in decluttering what could be described as a very busy, very complex funding environment by concentrating just on four things. What, how do we do it? Do we innovate? And how do we target? Good. I hope that helps. So there are, therefore, following that logic, three major steps that one can take in order to improve one's funding and income strategy. And the first one doesn't actually start out there with what's out there, but what's in here. So look in, what do we have? Then a look around. So what funding do we really need? And then a look outwards, how do we actually get started? So hopefully that look in, look around, and look ahead is a good strategy for you to sort of think about building a funding and an income strategy from the ground up. So let's have a look at the look in first and foremost. Number one, let's start with a goal or a BHAG, which is called a big, hairy, audacious goal. You know, we'll get back to that. Let's set a goal. Analyze what we have in terms of funding, track record, success, academic rigor, etc. Ask where you lack funding. And that is a deceptive question, because some NGOs just think, hey, we just lack funding. We just need funding. Well, where exactly? Which country? What works? What doesn't? What type of funding do we need? So let's detail and get under the skin of that question. Where do we lack funding? What type of funding applications are we successful with? So have a look at the record. Is a particular type or particular donor that we are successful with? Again, let's just get under the skin of that. And let's analyze what capacities we have. Do we have enough time in our programs team to write proposals? Do we have a good business development unit? Do we have a clear process for pushing out proposals? Do we have a clear process for identifying bidding opportunities? Or is it all haphazard? And then I would strongly recommend start summarizing the answers to this and many other questions into a funding strength and weaknesses list. Literally get a sheet of paper. I mean, as simple as this. What's our funding strength? What's our funding weakness? And list down the things you have and the things you lack. So that's a look in, and it takes account of where we are at right now. And then set a goal, that BHAG. If you're currently raising X, a reasonable goal is a 13 to 15% increase year on year. If you're a small organization, you might want to aim at more than that, about 15 to 50% increase year on year. So that is a reasonable goal. Bear in mind that doing 5 to 10% more year on year is actually at the moment almost below inflation in many countries, and certainly below the average growth rate for an NGO. To make this a little bit more specific, here's the cutouts of a report with we produced here with kind permission of an MZN client, and they started in 2014 with the funding mix of that I showed here on the left hand side. That NGO, British NGO by the way, had like 2/3 of its funding came from FCDO, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Development Office. there was a bit of an unrestricted fundraising campaign and some other fundraising, some friends and some investment income. And that's 2014. They then added some staff and some capacities. They said, look, this is the funding we have. It's highly reliant on the UK. We want to diversify this. We want to increase that, most importantly. So they've added 1 full-time staff, 1 part-time staff. They subscribe to the notification service by MZN, and they've held a quarterly business development workshop to tie it all together. So they've invested, and they've taken a more clear approach to saying, let's capacitate our business development. And sure enough, a bit later, they ended up with this. FCDO was still a large partner, but they broke into the EU, which now represents 1/3 of their income. Their fundraising campaign stayed the same, so comparatively, it actually delivers a little less, and the other income stayed the same as well. So the major addition here, in addition to a major increase in funding, which you can't see from this diagram, was the diversification, which right now, of course, is essential as the UK funding is going down. So by taking a look at what we have and where we want to get to, and adding some capacity, including a notification service, so that could be added, that could be contracted out. Nobody needs to scan and donor websites anymore and miss half the stuff, including a quarterly get-together and some staff. They've managed to do quite well, and that is quite a typical journey. So hopefully that helps you in deciding what you have. That look in should then continue with a look around. So who is our look around? I mean, things like what do we need and what is available? A bit of a donor mapping and see where our type of programming actually can attract funding. So the typical question is, what's our donor audience? Who do we share an audience with? Who can we partner with? Or who may be our competition? How much do we actually need? How much could we not implement? What funding would be ideal? Restricted versus unrestricted, and things like that. That look around is not yet setting a target for your funding. That's very important. You just become aware of your funding environment, your donor audience. Who could we listen to? Who do we have good relationships with? Who do we need to build relationships with? Again, it's not actually rocket science, but doing this in a structured way really helps. Having a quick look at I've got a bit of a funny slide here. Having a quick look at the question, what funding do we really need? And this is again taking from a assignment with a NGO client right now, here reproduced with client permission. And they have just listed their type of funding that is interesting to them. So government grants, service contracts, business, income generating activity, and they have a bit of a fundraising campaign and the membership scheme. And they've listed on the left-hand side the criteria which are important to them. Can we use the fund flexibly? How's the cost recovery? I'm using one more example. Is there any sort of longevity or sustainability to that funding? Can we keep receiving that funding? And then we've used together a simple smiley system, which makes the slide quite funny, I hope. But basically, a government grant is not sustainable. It ends after 3, 4, latest 5 years. So a bad smiley. A government grant is also not very flexible. We have to apply and say exactly what we do with it. However, we're reasonably happy with the cost recovery and the profitability or the surplusability, which refers here to the unrestricted part, of course. If we're looking at a income generating activity, obviously the surplus is very nice, and the flexibility of funding is 100% happy because it's their money. They can do with it whatever they want. But getting your own business started, your own income generating activity started, is quite a lot of work. So, securing funding, they were only reasonably happy with. One more example, fundraising campaign. They opted in the event at the end of the day for a digital campaign. And the level of effort in setting up a digital fundraising campaign from scratch, it's really high. It's really high. It takes a lot of money, a lot of determination, a lot of energy. So hence the bad smiley. But it may be worthwhile because maintaining and managing the funding is pretty good. And that's exactly what they've done in the end. So listing it out according to your criteria is a really good way of just looking around the funding environment. You can do that in an hour, 2 and a half an afternoon with your team. You can copy it from the slides that my colleague is kindly going to share with you all. The smileys will look differently for your organization, but hopefully that gives you a way to start on looking around. Good. Now let's have a look at a couple of funding trends to make it a bit more specific, to make sure that you have some information. So you've had information on looking in and looking around. Let's look ahead what is actually out there with the donors. Yeah, so these are obviously not a complete update on all the funding we have. That's the quarterly funding update webinar. Jules, I'm not sure if you can share maybe later when that is coming up next time, the quarterly funding outlook. Meanwhile, we had take a look at USAID. So USAID is taken as a single donor, still the largest donor in the world. And this is their 2023, this year's focus. You see, I only mentioned two. They are really trying to find corruption and advance democracy. That still is a long-standing priority for USAID. So if your programs relate to that, if your programs fight corruption or advance democracy or strengthen social cohesion or build civic rights, then that would be the fund you want to look into. Under this fund, there's a ton of calls and proposals being released. The next quarterly outlook of USAID should be coming out in a few weeks again. And at the moment, they are spending serious amount of funding here. Humanitarian assistance, also a long funding scheme. So if you're from a humanitarian organizations, you might want to look under the header of bolster humanitarian assistance. Then there is a Restoring US Climate Leadership Fund, just to highlight. This, by the way, is the fastest growing fund of USAID, currently only at 2.3 billion, but set to increase even more, as well as migration and reinforced global leadership. So these are all on the left here in red. These are all figures and these are all words that could mean a lot. But if you look at the USAID funding, if you start looking around, you probably get a good sense of what your organization needs by looking into these individual 6 envelopes. Underneath it will be calls, proposals of various different nature. I think there's like a few calls every week for proposals. Obviously, you should know about the proposals before they're even released. Otherwise, it's a bit too late. Those funding envelopes might give you a sense of direction, so you don't have to scan the entire website. Talk about websites. Let's look at the one of the largest donors, the EU. They only have 4 key priority areas in the current strategy, but it's even bigger. And the website, I apologize, is an absolute mess. It's written by consensus. But the EU funding is broadly organized in 4 distinct categories. The EU development funding, that is. So there's these protecting citizens and freedoms with these subcategories here that I'm not going to read out. You get the slides later. I'll pick one more. There's this climate neutral, green and fair social Europe, particular on circular economy, renewables, and these things they're pretty strong on, as well as economic support. There is a new one called Promoting Interest on the global stage. So it's a foreign policy-based development goal, and you will find that exact wording in envelopes on the EU website. And again, you can pitch when looking around what you do, depending on what organization you are at. You can look into these individual program types underneath it, which there will be funding calls. And I hope that this overview helps you navigate those 2 massive websites. If you do not, if you haven't signed up, or if you do not use funding support from MZN or another funding notification service. The EU then structured this into 3 major programs. There's the Horizon program, the Asylum Migration program, and the Global Europe. You might have heard about these terms before, but I just want to briefly mention them and give you a scaffolding, a structure to think about it, because the EU is such a complex beast. The Horizon program is the EU's research and innovation program. So if you do anything with innovation, if you do anything new, anything research related, be it from agriculture to social cohesion, to legal assistance, to migration, anything that is research based, you want to look for funding under the Horizon program. The asylum, migration, and irregular migration tools, they are literally based like 3 dots: asylum, migration, irregular migration. 10 billion this year. It's set to increase even further, but you want to look under the heading on the website under asylum migration. And global Europe is a term that you might have heard before. This is the new signature program from Ursula von der Leyen. And it basically summarizes up every cooperation the EU has with, developing countries, except for the pre-accession beneficiaries. So anybody that is that the EU is engaged with who is not a potential EU candidate can draw on this pot of nearly 80 billion euros. So it's a significant, huge pot, and it's growing larger. That global Europe is not to be confused with the term Team Europe. Just to be very clear, and again, the terminology of the EU is all over the place on behalf of the EU, which I'm not affiliated with. I'm sorry. Good. I hope that gives you a little bit of a brief view. We think we're doing all right on funding on this mini update here today. You can, of course, join us on the 6th of September. There it is, for a full funding update. This one was a small one. On the 6th of September is the next update for the quarterly update, what all the donors are doing. That's quite useful if you just want to get, it's much longer webinar, by the way. It's nearly an hour and a bit. Usually, is that right, Jules? It's an hour and 15 usually, these webinars. This one is one of the smaller ones. And there you, on the 6th of September, you get a full update of what all the major donors are up to. And I want to leave you, or get to the questions if you have any, basically with a simple quote, analysis result that we have done. NGOs who receive 70% or more funding from a single type of donor, so let's say that is an institutional donor, they have, in our research we've done between 2013 and 2016, a 75% likelihood of experiencing financial distress. Financial distress ranges from everything, between sort of being a bit tight on money to right up to bankruptcy. But interestingly enough, this drops massively when no income source presents that total that I present there. So if a little bit of the income diversification is applied, if no particular source hides is no more than 50% of the total funding, then this likelihood drops by 25%. In short, the more diversified your funding is, the less likely you're to experience financial distress. That seems like an easy one to understand. It sounds inherently right. What surprised me in our financial analysis between 13 and 18, where we've done this on the published financial results, is how much it drops when you just diversify a little bit. So hopefully that helps you in trying to gather the momentum and gather the energy that it takes to diversify your funding base as well. Good. Now, summarize it up, the look ahead. Having taken a brief look at USAID and the EU, so you really want to do it then. Find the right donors in your profile. You've done your smiley grid. You know what kind of donor you look for. You've invested maybe a little bit into your capacities there. Score them against the likelihood of success and the investment needed. You can easily score them, say, from 1 to 5. Bear in mind your previously prepared strengths and weaknesses, and now prepare opportunities and threat table. So score them from the highest scoring donor to the lowest, and then invest your time wisely into the highest opportunity donor. Scoring them against the likelihood and the investment needed will give you the maximum success of successfully applying for funding. If you are still stuck, use a sprint. I mentioned the sprint meeting earlier. Ask my colleagues from MZN to run a sprint meeting to help you get unstuck. It's usually a 2 or 3 day meeting where we build a new approach to business development or anything else, in fact. So feel free to ask Jules if you need any help on that. But by scoring them, using a sprint if needed, and investing into your business development capacity, that usually results in an increase in funding. So it's not rocket science. And hopefully these 3 steps help you. In terms of some of the clients we've done this with, you see them here on the right, in terms of to preempt the time that it needed, we've done these things typically in about 5 to 6 months. So the look in is usually takes the longest time, looking around what they have, because some of the data might not be there, 1 to 2 months. Looking around is usually takes a month or 2 as well, looking at what funding applies, and then the look ahead really goes fast. And this is where it all comes together. So this is not a 4-year strategy that you need to massively build support for or prepare for a change in strategy. This is a fairly simple thing. And I think in these 3 things, you can do them in 3 months minimum, 6 months maximum for the initiative to have some momentum. Good. I mentioned a sprint earlier. Briefly on that, and a sprint is basically a workshop that solves a problem in a short amount of time. So the decision making is forced through an agreed timeline and facilitating by us or by someone else if you want to. Basically, if you start a sprint meeting on Monday, you have a solution on Wednesday or Thursday. The sprint meeting is designed to sprint through a solution approach. For example, the rebuilding of an income strategy, or the restructuring of a business development team, or a overall program impact strategy. So it's usually 1 to 3 days, usually 2 to 3 days, in fairness. And if you are an MZM partner, if you are receiving funding support from us already, then that is also free of charge. Good. That's pretty much it for this short webinar. Thank you very much for listening. I hope that you took something away from it. If there are any questions, then let's get to them.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. We don't have too many questions at the moment.
Great.
One of the first questions popped up on one of our first slides, which is, what is a BD workshop in practice?
Cool. So BD refers to business development. Sorry. Oh, that's the last slide, actually. BD refers to business development. So a BD workshop would be to add resource and have a meeting across your team, with your programs team, your finance team, and your probably your leadership team, to sit together for 1 or 2 days and say, hey guys, how do we actually do business development? And do these 4 things I've mentioned before. So I think a good starting point are the 4 diagrams that I showed before. What's our donor targeting? What's our innovation approach? What is our programs approach? How do we communicate that? And that's sounds really simple, but it's really very rarely done.
Thank you, Chris. That was a great answer. We've had a few more questions pop up here.
Okay, let's get to it.
This is, I think, one of our favorite questions. Mick has asked, how do we become partners of your organization?
You reach out to my colleagues, including Jules, and you sign up to a funding support client. It's very easy. So contact us via the website, and that's it.
Thank you.
That's really easy, right?
Yeah, it's really easy.
I love these easy questions.
There was a question from Lo. I would love to know how that UK NGO pivoted after Brexit and no longer being eligible for EU funding. Yes,
Laura. Sorry, Laura. I'd love to know from which organization you are. So the question of EU funding is a complex one. By and large, the EU funding is for EU organizations, except for the Horizon program. So if you're a research NGO, you can actually apply as a third nation, a third country. Not just the UK, but anybody in the world can apply for Horizon funding. Also, if you're an organization in the least developed countries category, I hate that definition, by the way, but it's the definition they use. So in the least developed countries definition, you can apply for the humanitarian fund as an organization from them, because the EU wants to localize. So these funds aren't tied to EU membership. Most other funding is. So the ways around that are complex, and there are many organizations are setting up entities in the EU, but then you have to rebuild your track record, but of course your track record does not travel from the UK to the EU. Or you can buy an NGO in the EU, hence why we have our webinars on M&A, or you can, of course, just start building an engagement strategy. The one thing I would say, Laura, if you wanted to know more, again, please contact me. We've done a ton of these assignments recently, whereby we built an EU and EU member states engagement strategy without immediately registering and starting a organization here in the EU, because having registered an organization sometimes is just completely unnecessary.
Thank you, Chris, for that answer. Alex has asked quite an interesting question just on any tips on how to plan resourcing a fundraising strategy.
Well, you have to spend money to make money, would be my answer here. Of course, it can be incremental. So there are some fundraising and funding strategies that are very low costs, but also low success. So a peer-to-peer fundraising is something that you can set up quite easily. Takes only a few €100 or pounds. A Horizon Innovation Fund application, you can do that quite quickly without resourcing it too much. Ultimately, the rule is, and we have done some analysis in 2018 to 2020 on it, that those NGOs which continuously invest around about 7 to 12% of their overall funding into business development are also the ones that produce a constant growth rate. In other words, they spend significantly on business development and they continuously increase in business development. Again, sounds right. I mean, it's not rocket science. What I think many NGOs forget is that they get a grant, get completely busy with implementing it, and then it comes to the end and they're thinking, oh, what now? And then they're restarting business development. So I think one of the key things would be here to continuously invest into networking, use a subscription service, use, for example, MZN is quite cost effective, if I may say so, probably the cheapest one out there at the moment because of our non-profit status, in getting to know what funding opportunities come up, network with them, and keep that up over a number of years. If your mission is relevant, you should probably experience an increase in funding over years. This is not a, this is a marathon.
Thank you, Chris. Rosaline has asked regarding, you said that 15 to 20% goal would be reasonable for a mid-sized NGO. What size income do you consider as mid-sized?
So mid-size is defined by a mid-sized non-profit organization. There's an OECD definition, believe it or not, somewhere between 15 million to 20 million annual, 15 million to 50 million, so 15 to 50 annual implementation. So below 15, it's considered a small organization. Above 50 million euros, it's considered a large organization.
Thank you, Chris. We just have time for one or two more questions. So I'm just going to ask two more and then we will close our webinar. So Gabriel has asked, what do you consider the most critical factors for a successful fundraising in light of increasing restrictions for local organizations in the least developing countries?
So first of all, great question. Thank you so much. Two sort of narratives here. Fundraising refers to the raising of unrestricted income from private or corporate donors, just so we get the language clear. And if you are an organization from again, I hate the term, but it's used, from a so-called least developed country, then you're not as restricted in your funding as you might think. You are eligible to a lot of EU and EU member state funding. You're actually more eligible than UK organizations are. The question is then navigating the complexities and maintaining a commitment to pitch to, partner with, and submit bids to that. That commitment to maintain that is costly. So you're probably going to need a mix between private donations and donors to institutional funding, because either of the two is not going to work anyway. And Laura Treboski, I just see your notification that that terminology is used. Yes, I do find it very problematic as well. I think the funding, the term is coming from the OECD actually, but it's just not helpful. I completely agree.
Thank you, Chris, and thank you for your comment, Gloria. We have our last question for the day. Is there a means of monitoring trends in funding to help get a more flexible funding strategy?
Yeah. So there's principally three ways. Way number one, you do it yourself, which has to include in-person networking in Brussels, Frankfurt, London, and Berlin. The fact of the matter is that If you have never met the donors, they are very unlikely to meet you. Number 2 is subscribing to a algorithm run notification website. Funds for NGO, DevEx, development aid, what else is there? USAID Direct. So there's a number of subscription-based that can be quite expensive, actually, surprisingly, but they will try to keyword match what you do and send you a daily email. The advantage there, it's daily. The disadvantage there, it's not very targeted. So you still have to spend a lot of time going through it. And thirdly is you use a funding service, such as Amsterdam's, who match your program profile to the donor profiles, network with you and for you and with you mostly really to those donors, and develop one proposal after the next, so that over a couple of years you build a track record of submissions, and then eventually you will win one. It has never happened that it doesn't, but keeping it running is absolutely key. So these 3 things: do it yourself, algorithm run notification, or a funding service.
Great, thank you, Chris. We just have a few more minutes here. I just wanted to let everyone know about the rest of the webinars in our series. The next 2 coming up will be Merging NGOs, Experience and Reality on the 28th of June. So make sure you sign up for that. And then following that, in the beginning of July, we will have an NGO, a webinar on leading an NGO through uncertain times, which is very interesting at the moment.
Yes, indeed. It really is. Thank you.
Yeah, so please make sure to sign up via our website under our events, and any questions, hello@mzninternational.com, and we will do our best to answer them. Thank you so much, Chris.
No worries. And my email address is set down here as well. If there are any questions that you can think of later or we didn't get around to today, please email either hello@mzninternational or myself directly, chris@mzninternational.com. May take us a couple of days, but we'll get back to you, and I hope to see you very soon. And everybody stay healthy. Thanks for now.
Thank you.
Thanks for facilitating, Jules.
Thanks, Chris.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.